You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
Convenience stores sell 80% of the gas in the United States. So what makes one fuel retailer more efficient than others? An analysis of the top brands reveals what the winning brands have in common and where they differ. We're going to talk about that today in Convenience Matters. So joining us today are Brian Norris, who is the Executive Director of Retail Fuels for OPIS, the Oil Price Information Service, and Keith Reid, Editorial Director of Fuels Market News, which is a NACS publication. Welcome, gentlemen. And I want to start with you, Brian, and just, can you give us an overview? This whole report is based on OPIS data. Can you talk about how OPIS collects data and what you saw that fed into this report looking at the 50 most efficient brands?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak with you guys and to go through our publication. But so at OPIS in the retail division specifically, we track four types of data. We have our pricing data, which obviously OPIS is known for, where we track the real-time retail gasoline and diesel prices at all fuel stations in the U.S. as well as around the globe. But this report is focused on the U.S. And we get that data through a variety of data sources, getting nearly on a weekday about 5 million prices per day reported to us. We also, OPIS's foundation business, what we were started for was our wholesale rack pricing. And because we have that wholesale rack pricing, we're able to match every fuel station to the closest rack terminal and take into account things like brand and supply brand to match that up. And we come up with an implied margin. We take out taxes, a placeholder for freight, and essentially what you're left with is, the difference between the retail price and the cost, which we calculate as an implied margin. To clarify there a little bit, we don't necessarily know what a retailer's contract is with their fuel supplier. So it is just based on a standard OPIS methodology across the board. So, we don't take into account, if you're a high volume brand, maybe you have a better rate with your supplier on your fuel purchases. So none of that really goes into it. It's really just a, by the numbers kind of implied margin. So margin data is our second type of data in the OPIS retail group. The third type of data we have is market share data. And we have two sources for that data. The first is what we now call fleet transactions market share data. And that's based off of gallons that are done on certain types of fleet cards that we calculate. And then we take that information and roll it up by brand, by site to say, based off of the gallons that were sold on this fleet card, this brand sold this percentage of fuel in this region. So basically using that as a metric for overall market share for the fuel retailers. We've recently, over the last few years, partnered with a geospatial intelligence company to start calculating visit counts data. And that data is tracked via cell phone pings. We have geofenced every fuel station in the United States. And to simplify, I could speak for a long time about our methodology, but to simplify, basically, if a cell phone pings on that property, it's counted as a visit. And we use that as another metric for market share. We've looked at our fourth type of OPIS data, which I'll explain in a second, but some volume information that we have from fuel retailers to compare that to the actual visit counts data from the cell phone pings. And the correlation is incredibly strong. So that's a really good marker for overall fuel market share. Market share, third type of OPIS retail data. The fourth type is OPIS demand, or essentially fuel volumes. So nearly 30,000 stations in the U.S. provide OPIS with their actual sales gallons on a weekly basis, and we use that to create a scorecard for volume performance on a state-by-state level. So basically, volumes in this state are up 3% or down 3%, and we've used that to kind of provide that how big is the actual pie in fuel demand. Speaking of fuel demand, it's kind of a nice natural segue into what we've been seeing lately in terms of, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, on top of, the incredible spike in prices that we're seeing last year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We still see that overall, on a same store basis, gasoline demand is still trailing pre-COVID-19 levels, anywhere from 15 to 20% in the U.S. as a whole. In some regions, like the West Coast, it's still well above 20% behind where we were before the pandemic. So, there's still a lot of gallons that we at Opus just don't feel are necessarily coming back for the fuel retailers with the change in the workforce, with more fuel efficient vehicles, all of those things that are contributing to that. And the high prices last year also played a role. We did see that suppressed demand as well.
So, turning to Keith, you've covered the industry for decades, and now most recently with Fuels Market News. The podcasts that we do looking at the Fuels 50 are among our most popular. I think people really love seeing how the OPIS numbers translate and what they mean for efficiency. Not just who's in the top 10, but why are they in the top 10 or top 20 or top 50, and what can I do about it? So as you put together this year's report, what was the biggest top line message that you think is of interest to those listening?
Jeff, it's interesting because now that I have a few of these under my belt, I can start to pick out of some patterns that are developing or that seem to be some common factors for the top performers in the industry. And it's interesting, the average size of the top 5, which is one of the breakouts we do from the top 50, their operations between 400 and 1,000 sites. The top 5 this year were Wawa, Sheetz, Quick Trip with a Q, Maverick, and Racetrack. And what's become apparent is that the top 5 doesn't change all that much year to year. Frankly, the top 50 doesn't change that much year to year. And if we look back at the 3 years we've been working with Opus on this, and the data lags a year from the production date, we started in 2020 when you had lockdowns, you had low prices, you had low demand, you had a lot of supply, and here we are 3 years later with a tight market, disruption still going on, high volatility, higher prices, and the companies are the same. You would think if the company had a specific working model, that might not necessarily translate year to year as the market changes. But what it says to me is that, technology and any number of ancillary factors can be really important in driving efficiency. But it really suggests that one of the key factors is the quality of the leadership and the quality of the staffing, because it shows an awful lot of adaptability to some fairly rapid market changes. And, it's interesting because the size seems to be in that sweet spot between being a really large operation where, you have a lot of economies of scale, but you may not have that entrepreneurial drive anymore. And then the smaller operations where you have that entrepreneurial drive, but you may not have the economies of scale that are very effective. But again, it really shows that, and these companies, everybody's heard of these companies. I've heard of them 20 years ago, and every NACS education session you go to, there's somebody talking about how one of these companies does food service, or they do fuels, or they do any number of operational areas, and they've got a reputation for being very successful operators. And again, to wrap it back up a little bit, I think it really reflects that these are not just subjective opinions on these companies, but that there are actually objective data to support that they really kind of walk the talk.
Yeah, and I imagine that the factor why it's difficult to break into the top 50 is if you're in the top 50, you're doing things right, and while you do have to pivot, as we've heard, don't mess up your system. Just be able to pivot to the changing environment. So it makes it hard to rise into that top 50. Question for both of you guys in terms of topics is, what about the new entrance into the top 50 and some of the, shall we say, smaller companies, those that say have less than 60 stores? They are present in that top 50, just like stores with hundreds, chains with hundreds of stores. So take us through some of those. I guess I'll start with you on this one, Keith, in terms of some of the perceived smaller companies, and why may they have emerged in the top 50?
I think as with the top 5, you're going to see companies that a lot of people will recognize the names and will know that they're well-run, well-operated companies. In a lot of cases, they were close to the top 50 previously, but United Pacific's We Got It brand, Rod and Robbie, Fast Trip Food Stores, Parker's, True North, United Dairy Farmers. The one thing I noticed, and some of these jumped, 20 places or more to get in there. The one thing I noticed is that at least 3 of them, one of the areas we look at are whether you price above or below the market. And we touched on it a little bit earlier. One shift we saw I tracked in the 50 was that last year it was more of a 50-50 split between companies that priced below the market versus those that priced a little bit above it. And this year it was about 62% below, so there had been a shift in that direction. But I noticed that at least 3 of the companies that made it into the top 50 were among the lowest price companies on the list as well. So maybe that had something to do with it.
Well, I'll kind of add on to that, and I think Rotten Robbie's is a really good example. Based on where they are in the Bay Area in California, tends to be one of the highest priced markets in the country, and they are a lower cost retailer out there. They're on the West Coast. There's a lot of dealer operated sites, a lot of branded locations. Tends to be those stations tend to price higher than the market in general. I think with the spike in prices that we saw last year, I think that pushed a lot more consumers to find the lower price retailers than what we would typically see in a year. The price sensitivity, I think, was at an all-time high last year when prices were, well over $5 a gallon. So I do think that that's why you see a little bit more emphasis this year in the rankings on chains that do tend to price a little bit lower than their competition. Just to kind of emphasize, or to explain, when we're talking about how a brand prices against its competition in this report, we do that at the localized level. So we look at how, the average price for that brand compared to the average of all other fuel stations at the zip code level, and then we roll it up. So we always want to make sure it's a localized comparison. If you compare a brand that operates on the West Coast to a brand that operates in the Southeast, that's not really apples to apples in terms of the market and the price and everything. So it is a localized kind of what we call our price differential. And again, to reiterate, this year, it does seem that consumers were a lot more price sensitive than they had been in the past. And that's why we saw some of these lower price leaders make their move up the rankings.
I think that's an excellent point in that last year, the country as a whole saw $5 gas. California probably saw $6 gas, if not $7 gas. And the first thing you do is how can you save a couple bucks when everything else and you had inflation, et cetera. So here we are in 2023, and we're not necessarily predicting what will work or telling people what will work, but in a more traditional year, is there any of these 4 elements that go into the determining efficiency? Might one rise more to the top than others, like where we're seeing in 2023, where it's a little bit more of a traditional year? We probably have already seen our peak, possibly for the spring transition, which is already pretty much done. So what is advice for retailers as they look at 2023 and what they might want to do?
Well, I'll jump in first here. I certainly am not going to, all of these retailers are usually customers of OPIS in one way or the other. So I'm not going to frame this necessarily as advice, but, in an environment where there is still higher inflation, consumers are concerned about, their paychecks going as far as they used to. I do still think price is going to have a big factor this year. That being said, last year we had record margins in terms of what retailers were making on a per gallon. And on the surface, it looks like fuel retailers had a really, really good year in terms of gross profits. But there are some other things that factor into that I do want to make sure that we point out. Things like when the price is higher, so are the credit card fees. So that's eating into the margins. That percentage of the transaction is more of their profits than it was when prices are $5 than they were when they were $3. The struggle to find employees and reliable employees for the industry as a whole, and that doesn't just go for the C-store industry. That went for, all of the basically retail industries out there who are basically battling for the same type of employees. That drove wages up. Inflation impacted all of the businesses, so costs were a lot higher. So, take that into account. I do think that price is still going to be a big impact. Just to kind of reiterate what we saw last year, and maybe as a general caution to the industry as a whole, we don't include any of the big box or grocery in this report. This is a C-store strictly only. During that massive price spike last spring, into the early summer, the market share that big box stores and grocery gained, who are typically extremely low priced compared to the average C-store operator, was astronomical. And we saw that come right back down. So that is something to keep in mind, that when prices are high and consumers are their checkbooks are constrained, we see it in the data that they will go out of their way to sit in a line for 30 minutes to get the cheaper fuel than they would at a normal time. Now, we're not in that environment now. Inflation is easing a bit. Prices are not nearly where they were at this time last year. We're well below $1 below where we were. So I don't necessarily think it's going to be as big of an impact, but at the same time, all of those factors kind of make a big difference there. So I do anticipate that price is still at the forefront of a lot of consumers. The other thing I wanted to point out, and this is something that you'll notice with the top 50, and it's not necessarily advice, but the brands that you see in the top 50, even if they're just smaller count stores, they tend to have a very strong presence in their communities. And I think that goes really far. So making sure that you are a part of that community. You see the brands like a Delta Sonic. I think we talked about this when I joined you guys a couple years ago, but they're known because of their car washes, and they're in an area where cars get particularly dirty during the winter time. And so, everybody goes to the Delta Sonic to wash a car. And, there's little things in each kind of that each of these brands kind of focuses on for the most part that really makes them part of the community. And I think that's just as big of a part as, whether or not you have the best price and, in town. So I think there's a lot of factors, the different offerings that you have in the store, being a one-stop shop for people that are on their way to work or on their way home from their kid's sporting event or whatever it is. So, I think all of those things, if you look at the brands that tend to do the best, they tend to be that kind of neighborhood market, that place that people go.
I think Brian raised a lot of excellent points. It's, my advice would be one of the easiest things to say, but one of the hardest things to actually execute on, and it is execution. It's over the years I've been interviewing operators about this or that, and occasionally you get somebody that's doing something really well, but they don't want to talk about it because they feel like they're giving away the secret sauce. But in reality, all their competitors know what the secret sauce is. A lot of times the secret sauce isn't really a secret. It's a common operational best practice. And the problem is a lot of people know what they should be doing or the type of things how they should be structured to explore strategic development, to prepare for market shifts. But, the actual ability to execute is where the rubber meets the road. There's not a lot of secret sauce. You respect your employees, you respect your customers, you plan ahead, you find the right employees and get them in the right committees, you empower them to explore both conventional and unconventional opportunities that might exist. But it's so easy for me to say these things, and I'd like to think if I was running a chain I'd do it perfectly, but once you're actually dealing with the day-to-day operations, I'm sure it's extremely hard to actually fully execute when you're trying to put out the fire of the day.
So I think a lot of us at somewhere along the way, have, whether in college or wherever, have done some of these simulations where a professor says, okay, you have price, you have quality, and you have all these other things. Let's run through this, and how does the business go? What I'm hearing, and not just today, but there's so much nuance. And if you think, okay, I've looked at the top 50, but by the way, if top 50 will be out in another week or so, in your mailboxes and online. But if you take away that, okay, well, low price tends to get more customers, let's drop our price, you're missing the boat. Because as Brian said, Delta Sonic, their car wash is about experience. There's lights, there's colors, there's different soaps. It is truly an experience to go through those car washes. You talked about community. Well, you visited the Pride stores outside of Chicago. They say that nobody likes buying gas. So we focus on what people do like, and that's food and high-end alcohol. So they have a brewery there. They have high-end wine. So how do you develop that offer? And then how does your fueling offer support that? Because from NAC's perspective, we know when we do surveys, the latest one, 58% of consumers say when they bought gas, they went inside the store. So they go hand in hand. They do come for price, but can you move them because it's more than price? It's, I want to go there because I like them. They have a great price and I like them. So I guess that's probably one of the takeaways in here when you look at the top 50 list. Look at what they stand for, whether you know it intuitively or whether you know it by Googling each of those names. That they have a brand, and it's not we sell stuff. It goes deeper than that. And I guess that's the big takeaway, Brian.
Absolutely. You also, you bring up Googling, right? I do think, and actually I'm going to be joining a panel at the NAC show this year to kind of discuss this topic, but I do think that online presence is really important in this industry, and it's getting more and more important all the time. And if you look at most of these brands that are in the top 50, they're very good with their online presence. They have, great websites. Their websites talk a lot about their offerings. Some of them post their fuel prices, some of them don't. But if you think about the fact that more and more consumers are looking online to determine their purchases before they leave the house, if you're not online, you're leaving that on the table. So investing in your brand digitally and virtually, as well as having that great experience, I think is also really, really important. At OPIS, we see ourselves as the digital price sign for fuel retailers. And by digital price sign, what I mean is, obviously most of these fuel stations have these massive price signs out there, outside their store for when consumers are driving by. But, OPIS is the data source provider for Google Maps and Waze and Apple. And our data is used on those tools. We're also in probably about 30 million connected vehicles on the road today. So if somebody's driving their vehicle, they hit a button on their onboard dash that says, I need gas. If OPIS doesn't have your updated price that matches what your brand identity is in your market, some of these vehicles, for example, if they don't have an updated price for your store in the last 24 hours, if OPIS doesn't, the car doesn't have an updated price to display, they don't display it at all. So investing in your virtual presence is incredibly important as more and more consumers are shopping before they leave the house.
Yeah, and when you talk about online presence, I remember 15 years ago or so, there was a website. We're not talking about just having a website that says you're open and you're closed. There used to be this website called Gas Station Websites. They're hilarious because they're awful. And there, of course, is misspelled. And they would have great examples of like websites that had that music that sounded like it was provided by like the first video game. And there's like, all these other typos and just things that are extraneous. It's like somebody said you have to have a website. So they had a website, Career Sans font and all this stuff. But it's having a personality, and those brands do. It's part of the offer where yeah, it's still annoying to buy gas to most consumers, and probably never be something that's like, yay,
Something
today's
they have
Tuesday.
to buy.
It's Tuesday. It's not Taco Tuesday. It's Gas Tuesday. But how is it less of a burden? Keith, wrapping this all up, any final big thoughts in looking at the top 50 and what it all means for readers when this hits mailboxes or inboxes?
Absolutely. I'll just touch first real quickly on what you said about websites. We cover both the retail and the jobber world, and you still see a lot of jobber wholesale sites that are similar to the ones you describe there. But the supply side has always lagged the retail side, so it's catching up a bit. I think the best takeaway from the top 50, as well as the full report that you can get from OPIS itself, is it's just a pure benchmarking capability. If you're doing business in the markets that these companies are operating in, it's not necessarily a race to the top as much as you can see how they're doing in specific areas. If you have a really good handle on how your operation is running in those areas, you can benchmark and figure out, maybe your operation isn't quite as successful as you thought it was. Maybe it is, but there's room to improve, and maybe you're ahead of the game, but somebody's catching up. So, I think that's the important thing, is to use it, as a learning tool, really to see how you're doing and see how you can do it better and make sure you're still in the top 50, or you get in the top 50, or if you're in the top 50, you stay in the top 50 as the next report rolls around.
Well, thank you both for joining us. And the fuels market news, like I said, it'll either be in inboxes or mailboxes. You can also check out fuels market news at fuels, plural, market, singular, news.com. And of course, OPIS is opisnet, opisnet.com. Thank you both for joining us today. And thank you all for listening to Convenience Matters.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.